There's one set of effects that we haven't looked at yet, and that's the MClass mastering effects. But of course, you don't have to use them for mastering. There are 4 effects: the MClass equalizer, stereo imager, compressor, and maximizer. And then there's something called a combinator, which combines all 4 of them. Now, we haven't talked about combinators yet, but a combinator is essentially a mini rack within the big Reason rack, and you can combine multiple devices together into a single combinator and have it act as a device within your Reason rack. We'll talk about combinators more a little bit later, but for right now, just suffice it to say that the mastering combinator combines all 4 effects in sequence. I can use the MClass effects like any other effect in my chain. For example, the maximizer here is affecting the Dr. Octarex. But if I'm using them as mastering effects, we want them at the very end of our signal chain. And that means they come after the mixer, but before the audio interface. So you want to select the hardware interface and either control-click to add the mastering combo or just double-click it from the Tools window. And if we look here, we see the 4 effects that are in our mastering suite. And if we flip the rack over, you can see that the output of the mixer goes to the input of my mastering rack or mastering combinator. The combinator contains a chain of those 4 effects, and then the output of those effects goes right to my hardware interface. Now, a combinator, like any other device, can be collapsed or expanded. I can load patches, and there are a whole series of mastering patches for different types of purposes. So if you don't want to fool with the details of the mastering combo, you can grab a patch here that fits the type of music that you're making. But what you really want to do is tailor the effects for your song. And so we'll talk about the 4 effects now, starting with the equalizer. Let me bypass everything. Here's a song you may remember from an earlier video. Let's first work with the MClass equalizer. The MClass equalizer contains a low and a high shelf, 2 bands that you can sweep, parametric bands, as well as a low cut, which is good for cutting rumble below 30 Hertz if I turn that switch on. Each band can be turned on or off. I can set a frequency, a gain, and a Q, the width of the EQ. And here's what it sounds like. I can boost or reduce any band. Now, when you're mastering, it's always a good idea to bring up that big audio meter. And that way we can make sure that we're not clipping. You see those red lights? We were clipping before. And we're clipping again. We want to make sure when we're all finished that there is no clip indicator. And we'll get to that in a moment. But first, let's look at the stereo imager. Now, the stereo imager lets you take 2 areas of the frequency spectrum, a low band area and a high band area. The crossover frequency determines the cutoff between the 2. And then I can simulate expanding the stereo image of one or both bands. I can also solo each band, so I can just listen to the effect on that band. Let's solo the high band. So that's pretty much mono. And now I'm expanding it. Here's the low. And now I'm changing the point of split between the low band and the high band. And this is listening to everything. Now, the stereo imager won't work with mono material. The material has to be stereo to begin with. Next comes the compressor, which is a fairly typical compressor in terms of the settings available to it. Like all compressors, it works with the threshold setting and with a ratio setting. But this compressor has a sidechain input, which means you can use something else to trigger the compressor. You can see on the back of the compressor where you send in the sidechain input. And although we don't have time to talk about it now, it's a good idea to learn what sidechain input is and how you can make it work for you. Let me apply some compression to this mix. And then bring back up the gain. And finally, there's the maximizer. This applies a limiter to your song, and you can set the threshold for that limiter and how fast the maximizer acts. There's even a 4 millisecond look ahead, which helps the accuracy of the limiter, but it does add a little bit of delay. The maximizer allows us to get the loudest sound possible without clipping. The soft clip switch turns on a 0 dB hard limiter, which means that nothing's going to get past 0 dB. If the soft clip is turned all the way down, you have a hard digital clipping. If you turn the soft clip up, it's a much gentler limiter. Watch how high I can go without clipping. So it's pretty darn loud, but there's no clip indicator. As we saw before, I can choose different patches for my combinator, and I have different controls depending on the specific patch that I choose. And don't forget that the MClass effects are not just for mastering. I can take any one of the effects, or all four, and apply them to any other device within reason, and use the capabilities of those advanced MClass effects on my other devices within reason. And that's a quick look at the MClass mastering effects. But remember, they're not just for mastering.